John's holiday adventure. John's father was very rich indeed. He owned an enormous house called the Willows standing in its own grounds. He also owned 3 cars, a motor cruiser and 3 horses. Consequently, John had everything a boy of 12 could wish for. Everything, that is, except brothers and sisters to play with. He was on his own all the time he was on holiday from school because his parents discouraged him from inviting friends to stay with him. All this meant, of course, that John was a very lonely boy. So here he was at the start of a long summer holiday, and bored already, he simply didn't know what to do with himself. "Why don't you take a ride on Tara?" suggested his mother. Tara was John's own pony and a delightful little animal, too. "You could take a packed lunch and go over the fell," she continued. "But mind how you go." John considered this. It wasn't such a bad idea, he thought. After all, it was a beautiful summer's day and there was plenty wildlife to see over the fell if one kept one's eyes open. So, with a pannier of sandwiches and orange squash, John trotted off on Tara. "Do be careful, dear," advised his mother. Within a few minutes, John had crossed the old wooden bridge and was on the winding track which led over the moors and eventually right through to Scotland. It was called a Reivers Road and dated back to the times when the Reivers used to make raids over the border into Scotland and return with stolen cattle and sheep. This part of Northumberland was really quite beautiful in its own way, with the gentle fells gradually leading up to the wild Cheviot Hills, which formed a natural border between the 2 countries of England and Scotland, and John began to enjoy the ride immensely. Tara was a good, obedient and strong pony and quite liked being ridden by her young master. As John rode along, he noticed a wisp of smoke coming from a small copse about a mile away. He decided to ride over and investigate. Perhaps it was nothing to worry about at all, but one never knew. Unknown to John, inside the copse was a desperate rogue by the name of Arthur Smith. He had spent most of his adult life in prison and at the moment was on the run from the police for a robbery he had committed in Newcastle upon Tyne. It had taken him 3 days to get this far. He had traveled mainly by night, furtively using the quiet roads and lanes, and had been pleased to find the small copse which afforded him a certain amount of shelter and twigs and wood with which to make a fire. He planned to rest here for a couple of days before moving off again northwards, hoping to reach Scotland and eventually Edinburgh, where some shady friends would, for a price, be prepared to shelter and hide him until the hue and cry died down. The trouble was, however, that he was very hungry indeed. Apart from some small turnips, which he had piked from a field early in the morning, he had not eaten all day and was obsessed by the thought of food. He had lit a small fire partly to cheer him up and partly in the hope that he would be able to snare a rabbit or something which he would be able to skin and cook. It was odd, he thought, the fact that he had almost 300 pounds on him but could not provide himself with food. Just at that moment he heard the sound of horses' hoover. He uttered a curse and quickly slipped behind a large rook to conceal himself. He was surprised, and not a little frightened, for he really had not expected anyone to find him here. "Whoa, there, girl, whoa!" cried John as he rode into the copse. He dismounted and tethered Tara to a small tree, then walked over to the fire. From behind the rock, 2 beady eyes surveyed John furtively. When he had heard the hoofs, Smith had expected either the police or someone in authority. He certainly hadn't dreamed of being found by a young boy, and not a very big one at that. He stayed behind the rock until he was certain that John was alone. Then he suddenly jumped out, grabbed John's arm and snarled, "Gotcha!" John jumped, startled, and cried, "Let go! Let go!" But Smith would not release John and cruelly twisted his arm until it hurt him badly. "What's your name?" asked Smith, "and where do you live?" John managed to stammer out that he was called John Manson and that he lived in the Willows near Sherton. "If I let you go, will you promise not to run away?" said Smith. John nodded his head vigorously, only too pleased to be released from Smith's cruel hold. Smith reluctantly let John go, then stepped back and examined him. He saw a young boy of about 12 years of age with a freckly face, snub nose, and curly blonde hair. He looked a little afraid, but not as much as Smith would have expected him to. This boy was obviously no coward. Smith noticed that John's clothes looked well cut and expensive, and although he knew very little about horses, the pony's saddle was obviously not cheap. An evil thought suddenly crossed his mind. He could keep this boy captive until it was dark, and during this time he could get a good description of his father's house and grounds. There would certainly be good pickings there, he thought, silver, jewelry, and maybe money. He smacked his lips at the thought, and this served to remind him of his severe hunger. "Got anything to eat, boy?" he growled. "Yes," answered John. "Let's have it, then," said Smith. John walked over to Tara and undid the pannier to get the sandwiches and squash. Smith snatched the food and drink from John and began to wolf down the sandwiches. Although John was afraid of this man, he felt quite excited. If only he could somehow escape and get word to the police, the rogue would be captured and he, John, would be quite a hero. But how was he going to get away? If he made one false move, this man would obviously hurt him again, and he certainly didn't want his arm twisted again. It was still hurting where Smith's strong, dirty fingers had gripped him so hard. So he just sat still and watched Smith eating his sandwiches and drinking his squash. Perhaps, with a bit of luck, Smith would feel sleepy after the food and give John a chance to get away. After a while, Smith finished and looked hard at John. "You just stay where you are, boy," he snarled. "Yes, sir," said John. The man settled himself more comfortably, and soon the food he had eaten and the heat of the sun made him begin to feel very sleepy indeed. He could hardly keep his eyes open. John watched him very carefully. Within a few minutes, the man's head fell forward onto his chest and he was sound asleep. This was John's chance to escape. He quietly got up and carefully crept towards Tara. He reached the pony very quietly and turned around. The man was still asleep. John carefully walked Tara a good distance, then mounted her and galloped off as fast as he could. He felt very excited now, and he enjoyed the ride a lot. He had never ridden Tara as quickly as this before. He finally arrived back at the Willows in very good time. He soon told his story, and before long the police arrived. They found Smith still sound asleep beside the fire. He was very surprised indeed to be awakened by the police, but he felt so tired he was almost glad to be caught. At least he would get some sleep. So John became quite a hero, and his parents were very proud of him indeed. His father was so pleased, in fact, that he arranged for John's cousin, David, to come and stay with him for the rest of his holiday. Needless to say, John went to bed that night a very happy boy.